It began on a spring morning in the year 1509, when a 17-year-old boy stood at the threshold of the greatest throne in Europe, tall, broad-shouldered, with fiery red hair, a commanding presence, and eyes filled with the certainty that God had placed a kingdom at his feet. His name was Henry VIII, and England rejoiced, after years under the cold, frugal reign of his father, Henry VII. The people welcomed the arrival of a golden prince, a Renaissance heir, handsome, brilliant, athletic, multilingual, musically gifted, and eager to take the world in his grasp. But from the first moment he wore the crown, it was clear that this would not be a cautious king. He was not a man of moderation. Henry was fire wrapped in silk, thunder in flesh, a storm that smiled, and already, beneath the glory, the cracks had begun to form. Where his father had hoarded gold like a miser, clutching crumbs, Henry spent it as though coins fell from the heavens into his lap. Palaces rose at his command. Tapestries hung from every cold stone wall. Feasts stretched on for days, with silver platters piled high with venison, boar, and sweets moulded into the shapes of castles and dragons. His courtiers whispered in awe as he jousted, danced, hunted, composed music, debated theology, and thundered across the countryside like a god come to life. He was England made flesh, and he believed it. But even as he dazzled his people, one fear coiled around his mind like smoke in the rafters of his great halls. The question of succession. He knew too well that a throne without a son was a throne balanced on a blade, and history had taught him what happened to crowns that lacked heirs. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, and the widow of his elder brother Arthur. Their union had been forged to secure alliance with Spain, and at first, it seemed stable. Catherine was dignified, intelligent, deeply pious, and respected across Europe. She had even led England's armies to victory against the Scots while Henry waged war in France. But behind the courtly smiles and sacred vows, there was agony, repeated pregnancies that ended in stillbirth, miscarriages, or the deaths of infants. Only one child survived, a daughter, Mary, born in the year 1516. For Catherine, she was a miracle. For Henry, she was a disappointment, cloaked in velvet. The years passed, the cradle remained empty of sons, and Henry's mind, always restless, always reaching, began to turn against the woman who had once been his queen. He found his answer in a passage from Leviticus, a warning that a man who marries his brother's wife shall remain childless. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, Henry suddenly declared that their union had been cursed from the start, and fate, as always, offered him a new temptation, wrapped in dark eyes and French manners. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was witty, sharp-tongued, and unlike her sister Mary, who had once been Henry's mistress, Anne refused to surrender her virtue, not until he made her queen. It was a challenge Henry could not resist, but there was one obstacle between him and Anne's bed: the Church. When the Pope refused to grant Henry an annulment, the king made a decision that would shatter Europe. He tore England away from the Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of a new Church of England. The monasteries would burn, the priests would kneel, and anyone who denied him would hang, burn, or vanish in the night, all for the sake of a woman who had captured his eye, and the son he believed she would bear. Anne Boleyn was crowned queen in the year 1533, and soon after gave birth to a child. But it was not the son Henry had dreamed of. It was a girl, Elizabeth. He tried to smile, to feign joy, but disappointment pressed down like lead. When Anne miscarried again, this time, a boy, his love turned cold. The court filled with enemies, whispers sharpened into knives, and 3 years after their wedding, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. Among those accused was her own brother. The evidence was flimsy, but Henry did not seek truth. He sought freedom. Anne was beheaded by a French executioner on Tower Green in May of 1536, and even before her body had grown cold, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour, a quiet woman, submissive, modest, and obedient. Jane gave Henry the one thing he had longed for most, a son. In October of 1537, she bore him Edward, and then, like a ghost, she faded. She died 12 days after childbirth. And Henry, for the first time, wept not with rage, but grief. He wore mourning for 3 months. He did not remarry for more than 2 years. But his sorrow was not salvation. It was only silence before another storm. What followed was a parade of women, Anne of Cleves, whom Henry found repulsive and cast aside. Catherine Howard, a girl, half his age, whom he adored, then executed for adultery. And finally Catherine Parr, who survived him by nursing his decaying, ulcerated body until his final breath. Henry grew obese, unable to walk without assistance, his leg forever infected from a jousting wound that never healed. His temper grew more violent, his court more fearful, his enemy more cautious. He had become a man feared by all, even those who once loved him. And so, on a bitter winter morning, in January of 1547, Henry VIII died in his bed, swollen, silent, and alone. He was 55 years old. He had ruled for 38 years. He left behind 3 children, none of whom would bear heirs. And beside him, in the royal tomb, lay only Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him what he wanted, and died before she could disappoint him. He had beheaded 2 queens, destroyed a church, seized the wealth of monasteries, executed friends and advisors, and plunged England into a century of religious turmoil, all because one man could not accept a world without a son. They called him the Golden Prince, but by the end, he was something else entirely. A tyrant, a god of his own making, a king who burned the world just to carve his name into it. Before Anne Boleyn, before the break with Rome, before the crown grew heavy with death and disappointment, there was Catherine, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the mighty Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a woman born into the heat of Castile, who came to the cold, damp land of England as a girl promised to a prince, only to watch him wither and die in a marriage barely begun. She was not meant to be queen, not in the way it unfolded, not like this, but life, as Catherine well knew, was a tapestry woven by fingers beyond her control. And so, when the younger brother of her late husband claimed her hand, she accepted her place, heir duty, her fate. The year was 1509, and Henry was not yet a monster. He was a prince made of light, golden-haired, broad-shouldered, a vision of majesty that turned every head when he entered a room. And Catherine, though older by 6 years, was still young enough to hope. Their wedding was wrapped in ceremony, their coronation a thing of pageantry and prayers. And for a time, there was laughter. Catherine bore him sons, but they slipped from her body like water through a sieve, tiny corpses wrapped in linen, buried without names. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who breathed once, twice, and then were gone. Each one took something from her, a piece of her body, a piece of her soul, until finally there was only Mary, the daughter who lived, and Henry, for all his early affection, had no use for daughters. Still, Catherine endured. She was a queen in the fullest sense, gracious, devout, learned, generous to the poor, respected by foreign courts, and beloved by many of her people. She spoke Latin and French, could debate theologians with calm authority, and managed the court with quiet precision. She sat beside Henry in council, rode out with him in procession, prayed with him in the royal chapel, and when the Scots invaded while he was away, she donned armour over her gown, led the defence, and sent the bloodied cloak of a dead Scottish king to her husband as a gift of victory. Few women in the history of England had served their roles so fully, so fiercely, and yet it was not enough. Not for Henry. By the mid-1520s, the years had begun to turn on Catherine. She was in her 40s now, her face lined with grief and prayer. Her womb quiet. Henry still hunted and jousted and played his lutes. But there was an urgency behind his smile, a stiffness in his stride. He looked at his daughter and saw a problem. He looked at his wife and saw a curse. And in the glittering world of courtly pleasures, he began to look elsewhere. That elsewhere came in the form of Anne Boleyn. Anne was everything Catherine was not: young, sharp, irreverent, and tantalizingly out of reach. She was not the most beautiful woman at court, but she had presence. And more importantly, she said no, while others threw themselves at Henry's feet. Anne stepped back and made him chase her. She would not be his mistress. She would be his wife. And with each refusal, she drew him deeper into obsession. Henry, now in his mid-30s, found himself consumed, not just by lust, but by the idea of her, a woman who could give him a son, a new queen for a new England. But Catherine would not step aside. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she was Henry's lawful wife in the eyes of both God and man. She appealed to Rome. She prayed. She wept. But she did not yield. And Henry, thwarted at every turn, began to rage. He tore at the legal bonds that had tied England to the Pope for centuries. He summoned theologians, dismissed bishops, and elevated new allies. He cast down Cardinal Wolsey when the great Chancellor failed to deliver the annulment, and the court turned into a battlefield, with nobles and ladies forced to choose queen or king, Catherine or Anne, tradition or upheaval. Amidst this chaos, Catherine remained a tower of grace. She attended Mass daily, gave alms to the poor, and appeared at court with her head high, even as rumours swirled around her like flies. Her friends were exiled, her servants replaced, and eventually, she herself was banished from court, stripped of her title. She was moved from one damp, drafty residence to another, places unfit for a queen, where the ceilings leaked, and the stone walls wept in the night. She was forbidden to see Mary, her beloved daughter. She aged quickly in the cold. Her health began to decline. Yet still, she refused to admit that Anne was queen, or that her marriage had ever been anything but sacred. Imagine her, in one of those lonely manors, wrapped in furs before a sputtering fire, reading letters she was no longer allowed to send, hearing Mass in a private chapel, attended only by loyal shadows. Her hands, once soft, now calloused from years of prayer, her hair streaked with white, her back bent not from submission, but from the weight of holding her dignity against a tidal wave of humiliation. She might have entered a convent. She might have bowed to pressure. But Catherine was a daughter of Spain. She had royal blood, and she had buried too many children to surrender the only thing left to her, her name. Meanwhile, Anne had become pregnant. The court braced itself. Henry waited, and in the year 1533, a daughter was born, Elizabeth. The disappointment was palpable. Henry pretended joy. But already, the ground beneath Anne was shifting. Catherine was still alive, Still beloved by many, and now the woman who had broken a kingdom to gain a crown had given him only another girl. In January of 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. She had fallen ill months earlier, pain in the chest, a heaviness in her limbs, and she passed quietly, surrounded by a few devoted attendants. She was 50 years old. When the news reached Henry, he reportedly dressed in yellow, a colour of celebration, and rode out with Anne in public. The court murmured. Some wept. Some feared what would come next. And Anne, who had once smiled in victory, now saw the truth. Catherine had died. But she had not been defeated. In the minds of many, she was still the true queen, the martyr, the woman who had bled in silence while others shouted for power. Catherine was buried at Peterborough Abbey, not as queen, but as Dowager Princess of Wales. Her tomb was modest. Her memory was not. People left flowers. They whispered prayers. In time, they would call her a saint, and in the years to come, her daughter Mary would rise, red-haired like her father, iron-willed like her mother, and reclaim the throne that had been denied her. But for now, England was changing. The bells that tolled for Catherine's soul were drowned out by the hammering of reform, the tearing of altar cloths, the stripping of saints from stained glass windows. The woman who had once been at the heart of England now rested beneath cold stone, while the man who had cast her aside marched forward into new fires of his own making. Henry had freed himself, and yet he would never truly be free. For though Catherine's voice was silenced, her shadow would follow him to his grave. When Henry tore England from Rome and crowned himself the head of a new church, he did not simply change a few prayers. He set a furnace under the whole realm, and the flames would not be easily controlled. Power was a thing that had always lived in courtly displays and the hush of councils, but now it took on a new, terrible edge. The king's private desires and the machinery of law, fused together, could remake lives with a stroke. In the years that followed, the palace became a crucible where favour and accusation were hammered into either glittering reward or cold execution. And the people who once entertained the king's vanity found themselves learning an even older truth, that proximity to the crown was as likely to scorch you as to warm you. Anne Boleyn's coronation in the year 1533 was a triumph of pageantry, and for a while the court hummed with the intoxicating music of a new courtier era. The poetry and fashion of a queen who had once been a challenge, yet triumph and terror lived side by side in Henry's reign, like two mirrors catching the same light. Anne was brilliant, witty, and cruelly conscious of the thin thread on which she sat. She knew the joy of being adored and the peril of being desired. She loved to provoke debate in council, to nudge the levers of influence, to reward those who flattered her, and to spite those who would not be bent. Her enemies were many, and their resentments found purchase in the king's impatience and the realm's shifting loyalties. The machinery that had made Henry sovereign of the church could just as easily be trained on a queen. The dissolution of the monasteries gathered pace like a storm swallowing the coast. Inspectors went into cloisters and refectories, recording sins both petty and grotesque, cataloguing relics and charges of corruption, sometimes uncovering true abuses, often inventing scandals to justify Zeitsjure. Monks and nuns who had spent their lives in rhythm with prayer found doors shut against them, or pensions offered as consolation while their libraries and treasures were stripped and sold. Every abbey dissolved, every bell hauled away, meant not only loss of sanctuaries and charity, but a transformation in how the poor, the ill, and the lost were cared for. The monasteries had been more than buildings. They were a lattice of social life and memory, repositories of art, learning, and compassion, and their ruination left holes in the countryside that could not be patched by laws and ledgers. For Henry, the theft was tidy lands, silver, and plate that fed his extravagance and filled his coffers. For the country, The emptiness was long and subtle. Hospitals closed. Almona's gone. The old rhythms interrupted by an abrasive new calculus of profit and loyalty. Thomas Cromwell, the mastermind who rose from the ranks of a self-made man to become Henry's right hand, moved with a bureaucrat's precision. He rewired the machinery of governance to answer to the king. And in doing so, he made enemies whose complaints were not merely personal, but structural men of birth who resented a commoner's assent. Cromwell's project was to rationalize the realm, to turn church income into crown revenue, to weave law and administration into instruments that could secure Henry's will. But in order to consolidate, he had to break. He had to find traitors and feckless priests, to engineer trials that would set precedents and terrify potential dissenters. The machinery of the Star Chamber and the newly empowered Parliament became the steel cage around political life, once the law could be bent by the necessity of the moment. Precedent followed, and the next moment could be shaped by precedent. And then, as if to prove that law could be made into an executioner's glove, charges began to gather around those closest to the Queen. The brilliant Anne, who had once dared to counter the priestly language at court and to laugh in the face of convention, found herself accused of the most intimate betrayals: adultery, incest, plotting the king's death. The accusations read like a grotesque play lovers named Rendezvous Described, a story stitched together that made sense only if one accepted the king's suddenly brittle mind and the court's readiness to obey. Why demand proof when the crown's interest was clearer than truth? Trials were swift. The court that a few years earlier had toasted her now watched in stiff silence as she was led to the Tower. The procession down to the scaffold at Tower Green was short and precise. And in the chill of that May morning in the year 1536, Anne's head fell. Her executioner, brought from France because the English men-at-arms could not be entrusted with such a deed, performed the task with a single clean blow. The spectacle was designed to be both mercy and message, a quick end for a queen, a demonstration that no one, however adorned, could withstand the king's will. Anne's death was a turning point, not simply because a queen had been executed, but because it showed how easily the sovereign's caprice could be sanctified by law. If the crown could convert a failed marriage and a personal disappointment into a national security concern, then what remained inviolable? It shattered the illusions of many at court who had once relied on custom and birthright. And even those who had prospered under new arrangements learned the bitter lesson that favour could evaporate overnight. The court's laughter turned to careful, minted smiles, the way furniture is rearranged when one knows a storm is coming. Yet the blood did not stop at Anne. The pilgrimage of power continued with a grim regularity. Cardinal Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, once among the king's respected councillors, both refused to endorse the king's supremacy over Rome, and both paid with their lives. Their executions were not merely personal tragedies, but warnings roared in stone and iron across a kingdom, learning to speak in the language of survival. The North rose once, in what would come to be called the Pilgrimage of Grace. In the year 1536, an insurgent tide of peasants, monks, and noblemen rising to protest the theft and the Reformation, waving banners for the old rights and demanding redress. Henry answered with promises, and then with a cold dispatching of leaders. Executions that taught a simple lesson. Rebellion would be met, not with negotiation, but with the blade. There were other bloodied corners. The fall of Wolsey, once the most powerful man in England, was theatrical in its own right. Stripped of office, accused, and dying while his enemies circled like wolves. His failure to secure Henry's annulment provided the opening for Cromwell, and the machinations that followed read like a slow, political murder. Reputations shredded, alliances broken, loyalties traded for position. Men who had thought themselves untouchable found bills of attainder, a legal instrument that made Parliament a mirror of the sovereign's vengeance, used as a blunt tool to remove rivals. The court became an arena of legal executions as much as swords or poison ever had been. And yet amidst the terror, were ordinary lives crushed beneath the wheels of reform. Abbey libraries were burned or sold, manuscripts cut up for scrap, bindings used to patch boots, sacred objects melted into coin. The poor who once turned to monasteries for bread, shelter, and medicine found fewer hands to receive them. The dissolution redistributed wealth. Yes, but it also stitched a new class of landowners to the crown. Men who would defend the new order because their fortunes were newly purchased. And with their land came loyalties that could be counted on a map as easily as on a ledger. Henry had created a social fabric bound by land and the king's favour. He had also scattered the threads of an old moral economy that would not be easily rewoven. As the years wore on, executions became almost a rhythm of governance, an after-dinner groove of terror matched to proclamations and new laws, so much so that the presence of an executioner's block in the tower or outside the city gates was an accepted, if grim, part of political life. Noblemen and women who once danced in embroidered silks found themselves reduced to names on lists, their properties forfeit, their families disgraced. The king's appetite for spectacle had fed on culture, and now it fed on fear. Through it all, Henry's personal life continued to shape policy. His marriages, his griefs, his grudges were not private matters, but public instruments. Anne Boleyn's coronation and execution, Jane Seymour's gentle mourning and early death, the brief, comic disaster of Anne of Cleves, the youthful, tragic Catherine Howard's fall. Each domestic drama sent ripples into the nation's institutions. The personal had become political to the extreme that one could no longer separate the shape of a marriage from the shape of religion. And when the scaffold took one more head, the message was never merely that one woman had been found wanting. It was that the king's will must be obeyed, and that law would be moulded to carry out his desires. By the time Henry's body began to show the ravages of age, by the time his leg festered from an old tournament wound and his weight grew grotesque, the country had been changed in ways that would outlast his bones. The dissolution had handed estates to supporters, had bankrupted the crown, and then refilled its coffers with a different class of loyalists. It had torn down shrines and redrawn the map of pastoral care. It had taught a people to fear the sovereign's whispers as much as his proclamations. The crown, once a symbol above men, had become an iron hand that could turn affection into accusation, favor into forfeiture, and courtly laughter into silence. And so, when tales are told of Henry VIII, the Golden Prince who danced and hunted in early years, the shadow of the scaffold follows as surely as dusk follows day. The crown had been drenched in blood, and beneath its gleam lay a very human hunger, one man's fear of the future, morphing into a state's appetite for power. The laws had been bent. The monasteries were ruins. The courtiers had learned to bow with a new kind of terror. When you close your eyes now, and imagine the hush after an execution, the hush that falls over a hall where only loyal faces remain, you will sense what it meant to live under a king who had made his private needs the engine of national transformation, and who would not be satisfied until his will, whatever shape it took, had been made irrevocable. The headsman's axe had not yet cooled from Anne Boleyn's execution when Henry moved swiftly, as if to cleanse himself of the act by replacing her in the royal bed. Only 11 days later, the king married Jane Seymour, the quiet one, the gentle one, the pale-haired woman with soft eyes, who seemed to offer neither fire nor ambition, only stillness. After Catherine had defied him and Anne had challenged him, Jane Seymour seemed like a return to order, a woman made of obedience, whose silence was her shield and whose presence was like linen folded in a drawer, neat, untouched, unthreatening. To Henry, she was a balm, and more importantly, a vessel unspoiled by noise or scandal. He believed that in Jane, perhaps at last, he would find peace. Jane had served both of Henry's previous queens as lady-in-waiting. Watching history unfold in whispers and executions, she had seen how love turned to suspicion and how crowns could strangle. She had no desire to provoke, No hunger for power, only the quiet ambition of a woman who knew the rules and intended to survive them. Her motto, "Bound to obey and serve," was not just embroidered on banners, it was stitched into the seams of her soul. When Henry came to her, grieving one queen and disgraced by another, Jane did not resist. She yielded, but in her yielding, she conquered. The court held its breath. The king, now in his mid-40s, was no longer the bright god of 1509. He was heavier, moodier, more bruised by the scars of his reign, but still desperately clinging to the need for a male heir. Jane, with her quiet smiles and folded hands, became the country's last hope for peace. She played her part with perfect restraint, avoiding political entanglements, never speaking out of turn, never interfering in matters of church or council. And yet, for all her quiet, she achieved what neither Catherine nor Anne had delivered. In the early autumn of 1537, Jane Seymour became pregnant. The court erupted with cautious joy. Midwives were summoned. Physicians stood ready. Henry, usually so consumed with politics and punishments, hovered at Jane's side like a man guarding a flame from the wind. For months, England waited. If Jane delivered a boy, her place in history would be carved in gold. If she failed, her crown, like those before her, would grow sharp. And then, on the 12th day of October, 1537, the bells of England rang. Jane Seymour gave birth to a son. They named him Edward, after Henry's great Plantagenet ancestor, the symbol of chivalry and English pride. The child was healthy. The line was secure. Henry wept. Openly. In joy. Bonfires were lit from London to York. Church bells pealed across the kingdom. Wine flowed in the streets. Even the weather, they said, softened for the occasion. For a moment, a brief, trembling moment, the country believed that the long night was over. But joy is a thing made of breath and bone, and both can fail. Jane had laboured for 2 days and 2 nights. The child was born, but the toll was immense. At first, she seemed to recover. She was bathed, given broth, tended by the finest healers in the land. Henry visited her bedside, beaming. The boy was christened in the royal chapel, in a ceremony that felt more like a coronation. Jane sat watching, pale and trembling in a chair beside the font. But soon after, her health began to turn. The fever came quietly at first, just a flush on her cheeks, a tremble in her fingers. Then came the chills, the sweats, the racing pulse. In the age before antiseptic or understanding, the childbirth bed was as dangerous as the battlefield. Jane had fallen victim to childbed fever, an infection that crept through the torn flesh and spread like fire in dry hay. Nothing could stop it. The herbs failed. The prayers were unanswered. The blood, hot and wild, ran unchecked. 12 days after giving England a prince, Jane Seymour died. It was the 24th day of October. Henry locked himself in his chambers and did not emerge for days. For the first time in his life, he wore black not as a symbol of royal authority, but of genuine mourning. There would be no quick remarriage, no new queen waiting in the wings. He had gotten what he wanted, an heir, and paid for it with the only wife who had never failed him, never crossed him, never defeated him. Jane was, in Henry's mind, the perfect wife, silent, frightful, and conveniently dead before politics could sour the memory. She was buried with ceremony befitting a queen, in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beneath a vault meant for Henry himself. He would never allow another woman to lie beside him in death. Jane alone had earned that right. In time, when the bloated body of Henry VIII was lowered into the same vault more than a decade later, it was Jane Seymour who greeted him in death, Jane, the ghost who had given him a son and then vanished before she could disappoint him. But Edward, the child born of that painful triumph, would not bring the peace his birth had promised. Though his early years were wrapped in velvet and watched over by tutors and guardians, his mother's death cast a long shadow. Without Jane, the court became once more a landscape of shifting factions, foreign alliances, and the ever-present need for another queen. Henry remained unmarried for more than 2 years. After Jane's death, the longest he had ever gone without a wife. It was not only grief, it was calculation. He had the heir. Now he needed political security. During this period of mourning, the court quieted, the executions slowed, the feasts became less frequent, and for a time, it seemed as though the fire that had driven Henry for decades had grown cold. But embers do not die so easily. Beneath the ash, the furnace waited. The machinery of monarchy still turned, and the need for alliances would soon push Henry toward marriage once more. Still, those 2 years were a strange pause, a lull in a reign marked by noise. Jane's portrait hung in Henry's private chambers. Her memory was praised. Publicly, and often, she was spoken of as his true wife, despite having worn the crown for only 17 months. In Jane, Henry saw the version of himself he wished to preserve, the just king, the triumphant father, the man who had finally been blessed. Her death froze her image in perfection. She never aged. She never fell from favor. And in her stillness, she became untouchable. But around that stillness, the world continued to move. The nobles whispered of who might be next. Foreign envoys came with painted portraits of eligible duchesses. Henry's advisors, some driven by strategy, others by self-interest, debated the merits of Cleves, of France, of alliances in the Protestant north. Henry, mourning Jane, demanded youth and beauty and political usefulness, all in one package. The image of Jane, serene in death, haunted every prospect. None would match her, but one would be chosen. And all the while, little Edward grew. He was a delicate child, quiet and watchful. He read early, prayed often, and was groomed for rule from the moment he could hold a quill. His governesses were strict. His tutors were brilliant. The weight of England lay across his cradle like a shroud. They called him the heir. They called him the future. But few noticed that he coughed more than he should, or that his small hands trembled when he was cold. The boy born in joy, at the cost of his mother's life, would carry that debt on fragile shoulders. Jane Seymour had done what no other woman could. She had given England a prince. But she had done more than that. She had taken a monster king, scarred by betrayal and ambition, and stilled him, briefly, with something resembling love. She had made him mourn. She had made him stop. And then, like a ghost receding into candlelight, she was gone. After 2 long years of mourning Jane Seymour, the court began to murmur again. The black velvet draped across Henry's private chambers had begun to fade. The flickering candles that once burned beside her portrait now only lit his path back into the game of alliances. He had a son, fragile though Edward was. The child existed, and that was enough to raise England's hopes from the ashes. But in the landscape of European politics, a prince was not sufficient to keep the wolves at bay. France stirred. The Holy Roman Empire watched. And Henry, older now, more swollen in flesh and tempered by pain, was still expected to act. He needed a wife not for love, not even for desire, but for strategy. That wife would be Anne of Cleves. The match was arranged not through courtship but through canvas. Diplomacy passed between couriers and portraits, oil and pigment standing in for conversation. Henry had not met her, but Hans Holbein, the court's brilliant painter, had a motting. He stood before Anne in the cold corridors of the Duchy of Cleves and captured her image on stretched linen modest dress. A demure expression, her pale hands folded just so. When the painting reached England, Henry was intrigued. She looked respectable, Protestant, dignified. Her family stood firmly against Catholic powers. She seemed, on canvas, a solution. So it was agreed. Treaties were signed, gifts exchanged, and Anne, the daughter of a foreign duke, crossed the sea to become the Queen of England. It was early January. The year 1540. The wind was bitter. Her arrival was met with formality and festivity. But Henry, ever theatrical, had something different in mind. He would surprise her. Without warning, he rode to Rochester, entered her chambers in disguise, and waited for her to recognize him the sovereign Lord of England, come to sweep her into his arms like a knight of legend. But Anne did not recognize him. She saw only a strange, aging man, red-faced and overdressed, beaming at her with expectation. She curtsied, confused. She said the proper words, but the moment was ruined. Henry returned to London pale with fury. "She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported," he said bitterly to his advisers. "I like her not." He told his confidants she smelled wrong, that her skin was coarse, that he could not stir himself to consummate the marriage. He called her a Flanders mare, a cruel insult, whispered through corridors like rot beneath the rafters. But the political machinery was already moving. The wedding proceeded on the 6th of January. In a solemn and quiet ceremony, Anne wore English fashion. She smiled. Henry gritted his teeth and gave her a crown. But behind closed doors, nothing happened. The marriage was never consummated. Henry could not bear to touch her. He told his physicians that he had attempted it, that he had kissed her breasts, but found them slack and loose. The court grew anxious. Rumours spread. Anne was bewildered. She had done what was asked. She had spoken no heresy, caused no offence, worn her new clothes, and curtsied in all the right places. But it was not enough. Not when the king's eyes had already begun to wander toward a young woman of quiet voice and gentle ways, Catherine Howard. A lady in waiting, who was everything Anne was not. By summer, Henry had made up his mind. The political need for Cleves had evaporated. France and the Empire no longer threatened England's isolation. Cromwell, the architect of the marriage, had fallen from favour, and Henry, determined to be rid of Anne without bloodshed this time, set the gears in motion. The marriage was annulled in July. The official reasons, non-consummation, and Anne's pre-contract with a previous suitor, she agreed without protest. No trial, no tower, no scaffold. For her compliance, Henry rewarded her handsomely. She was given estates, income, servants, and a new title, the king's beloved sister. It was a strange mercy in a reign not known for gentleness. But Anne, clever in her own quiet way, had read the signs better than queens before her. She had seen what happened to women who resisted. She had no wish to become bones beneath the chapel floor. And so, she bowed her head, signed the papers, and lived. She outlived them all. Anne of Cleves remained in England until her death in 1557. She kept her lands. She kept her head. She remained friendly with Mary and Elizabeth, Henry's daughters. She watched as queens rose and fell. She wrote letters in German. She kept her own chapel. She tended her gardens and attended court when invited, always with an enigmatic smile. In time, she came to be seen, not as the mare Henry had mocked, but as the cleverest queen of them all, the one who survived. But her survival was also a sign of something darker. The Henry who had raged against Catherine and destroyed Anne Boleyn was changing. His body was failing. The wound on his leg had deepened into a foul-smelling ulcer, that resisted all attempts at healing. He could no longer mount a horse without assistance. His weight had ballooned. His breath came short, but his pride remained unbroken. He could not bear insult, even the imagined kind, and so he turned on Cromwell, the man who had risen from nothing, orchestrated the break with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and dared to arrange a marriage the king found displeasing. Cromwell was arrested in June of 1540, accused of treason, heresy, and 1,000 other convenient charges. He was executed by the end of July. No trial, no chance to plead his case. His head fell like so many others before The king, bloated and sweating, sat in his chambers and signed the warrant with a flick of his pen. And yet less than a year later, Henry would confess that he regretted Cromwell's death. But it was too late. The wheel had turned, and now a new girl waited in the Queen's rooms. Catherine Howard was perhaps 16, vivacious, lively, fond of jewels and dancing, a cousin of Anne Boleyn, young enough to call Henry grandfather without irony. She had known poverty, then pleasure. She had lovers before the king ever looked at her. But when he did look, when his heavy eyes fell upon her, wrapped in silk and light laughter, he was smitten. He called her his rose without a thorn. He placed her above all others. He gave her rings, pearls, diamonds, and dresses sewn with cloth of gold. And behind his wide, wheezing smile, the court held its breath again, because everyone knew how this story could end. They called her a rose, and they gave her a crown. But no one ever told her that roses wilt quickly in the frost. Catherine Howard was barely more than a girl when she became Queen of England. Not even 20 years old. Not yet full-grown in spirit or in caution. She had the smooth skin of youth and the careless joy of someone who still believed that music could silence fear. And when Henry looked at her, this fifth wife, this pale flower in a court of iron, he did not see a girl. He saw his own vanished youth reflected back to him. He saw a second chance. He saw something beautiful and untouched, though it was all illusion. The year was 1540. The marriage to Anne of Cleves had been swept away like a failed painting torn from the wall. Cromwell, who had arranged it, had paid with his head. And now, in the gilded corridors of Whitehall and Hampton Court, there was a new queen, the kind of queen who danced before she spoke, who laughed before she calculated. Catherine Howard, cousin to Anne Boleyn, niece to the powerful Duke of Norfolk, had stepped into history's cruelest snare with slippered feet and perfumed innocence. Henry, by now over 50, bloated, slow, and burdened with a festering leg that stank through his robes, treated her like a miracle. She called him her sovereign lord, Her Lion. He had defended her, and he called her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with gifts, gowns thick with jewels, lockets engraved with their entwined initials, pearls that weighed down her neck until it hurt to lift her head. And through it all, the court played along, smiling, bowing, pretending not to see the grotesque difference in age, in power, in gravity, but underneath the silks and songs, secrets stirred. Catherine had a past. Everyone at court had a past. Of course, but hers was not one that could survive the light. Before the crown, before the king's heavy kisses and public adoration, there had been others. Henry Mannix, a music teacher with wandering hands, Francis Derham, a former lover who had called her wife and spoken of promises in the dark. These names were known to some. Whispers passed through the corridors like drafts through ancient stone. But no one dared breathe too loudly. Not yet. And then, there was a present. While Henry limped through ceremonies, dragging his ulcerated leg and clinging to the illusion of youth, Catherine had found comfort, perhaps even affection, with another man, Thomas Culpeper. Young, Handsome, a member of the king's privy chamber, the kind of man who could make a girl forget the stench of medicine and the way her husband's breath caught when he walked. Their meetings were arranged in secrecy, but nothing in Tudor court life stayed secret for long. Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother, helped them. She who had once stood beside another doomed queen now lit the path for a second to fall. In the autumn of 1541, the web began to tighten. The first rumours came to Archbishop Cranmer. He hesitated who wouldn't. This was no minor sin. This was treason. Adultery for a queen was not merely a personal failing, it was a threat to the succession. A crack in the divine order. He placed a letter of accusation beneath Henry's prayer book during Mass. Unable to say the words aloud, when Henry read it, his first reaction was rage. No, not rage refusal. He would not believe it. He could not. Catherine, his innocent rose, his joy in the night. His rebirth, she could not have betrayed him. But evidence piled like frost on the windows. Derham confessed. Culpeper wavered. Letters were discovered. Servants talked. And slowly, like a man awakening from a dream soaked in wine, Henry began to see he had been made a fool. Again, the betrayal was too sharp to ignore. This was not politics. This was personal. He wept. It was said he shut himself in his chambers and raged like a wounded animal, demanding a sword so that he might kill her himself. And Catherine, she was locked in her rooms. The laughter drained from her throat. The gowns lay untouched in the chests. Day and night blurred into the same terrible stillness. When the guards came for her, she screamed. They say her cries echoed down the halls of Hampton Court like the howls of an animal caught in a trap. She begged to speak with the king. She begged for mercy. She begged to live. But Henry did not see her again. The rose had grown thorns, and thorns drew blood. She was taken to Sion Abbey first, then to the Tower of London, the same grim fortress that had once held her cousin Anne. The same walls, the same steps, the same cold wind. The charges were formalized: adultery, treason, a queen who had betrayed her sacred bond. The punishment was certain. On the night before her execution, Catherine is said to have asked for the block to be brought to her. She wanted to practice. She wanted to know how it would feel to kneel, to lay her head, to wait. Imagine that a girl of 17, alone in a stone room, rehearsing her own death. She may have whispered to the shadows. She may have prayed. She may have cried. No one knows. Only the silence remembers. On the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard walked to the scaffold on Tower Green. She wore a black velvet dress. Her frame was small, her face pale. She needed help ascending the steps. She spoke briefly, acknowledging her sins, asking forgiveness. And then she knelt. The axe fell. The echo lingered. Lady Rochford followed her to death soon after. Madness had delayed the execution, but not prevented it. The Queen's ladies, once her companions in gossip and dance, stood weeping as the tower's crows circled overhead. The rose had withered. The blood had been spilled. And the king, once again, was alone. But something in Henry shifted that day. He did not speak her name again. Not once. He ordered all traces of Catherine removed from his palaces. Her portrait vanished. Her initials, carved beside his in stone and wood, were scraped out, covered with plaster, or re-etched with the letters of other women. He signed a law making it treason for any future queen to conceal her sexual history from the king. And then he turned inward, more bitter than before, more certain that he could trust no one. His leg worsened. His temper darkened. The feasts became dull. The court moved like ghosts. Catherine Howard died young, but her memory haunted the walls of Henry's world like a sob heard in a dream. She was the Rose he could not protect. The girl who should have been happy. The queen who died, screaming. By the time Henry began to consider his sixth wife, he was no longer a man shaped by passion. He was shaped by pain. The king who once dazzled Europe with his beauty and strength now required winches to be lifted onto horseback, could barely climb stairs without groaning, and left behind a wake of rot from the ulcer that festered in his leg. His waist measured over 54 inches. The bandages that wrapped his wounds soaked through with pus and blood, and the air around him, no matter how perfumed, carried the scent of infection. His court watched him carefully, his every movement, his every twitch, to his every breath, because this was no longer a monarch in command of his destiny. This was a lion whose body was failing, but whose roar could still kill. After Catherine Howard, he withdrew for a time, cloaking himself once more in grief and suspicion. But kings cannot remain widowed for long, and Henry, ever aware that enemies circled beyond England's shores and within his own court, knew that one final match might yet serve him. He did not want beauty anymore. He did not need passion. He needed comfort, loyalty, peace. And so, in the year 1543, his eye fell upon a woman who had neither youth nor danger about her. And that, perhaps, was why she survived. Her name was Catherine Parr, twice widowed, 31 years old, no great fortune, no great scandal, but with a mind like a steel trap and a heart tempered by experience. She had not been raised for royalty, but for competence, educated in languages, philosophy, and religion. She had known love and loss. She had managed households, lands, stepchildren. She was kind, but not naive, cautious, but not cold. And when Henry looked at her, perhaps he saw, at last, someone who would not fight him, or betray him, or break beneath his weight. Catherine did not want the crown. Her heart belonged elsewhere, to a man younger and more charming, Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour. But when the King of England desires you, and you have already buried 2 husbands, there is only one answer you are allowed to give. She said yes, and in doing so, she saved her life. Their marriage was quiet by Tudor standards. No lavish tournaments, no processions through cheering crowds. Just a tired king and a wise woman entering a contract built less on passion than on necessity. But Catherine did what no wife before her had managed. She soothed the monster. She nursed him. She read to him. She arranged the medicines that soothed his leg. She ensured his pillows were fluffed, his food properly cooled, his moods respected, and when he raged, as he still did, she knew when to retreat and when to speak. Her intelligence became a weapon she kept sheathed, except when absolutely necessary. She also brought the royal children back into his orbit. Mary, now a woman in her late 20s, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, brilliant and sharp-tongued, and young Edward, the fragile prince, barely more than a boy. Catherine made the royal household a place of learning again, of books, scripture, and quiet order. She encouraged the education of Elizabeth in particular, fostering the girl's love of Latin, Greek, and rhetoric. The old king's court, once a stage for flamboyance and blood, was now a chamber of shadows and whispered diplomacy. Catherine understood this change. She survived by it. But even this queen, steady and obedient, was not beyond suspicion. Catherine Parr was a reformer at heart. She read forbidden texts. She corresponded with Protestants across Europe. She even published a religious book of her own, Lamentations of a Sinner, the first queen in English history to publish under her own name. She believed in reforming the church, not just in name, but in truth. And though she was cautious, the king's courtiers, especially the conservatives who loathed change, watched her with growing unease. In the summer of 1546, her enemies made their move. A warrant was drawn, charge préparée. The accusation heresy, that she had spoken too boldly of the scriptures, that she had questioned the old Catholic rites, that she had strayed too far into dangerous waters. Henry signed the arrest order, but fate, as always, turned on a whisper. Someone warned Catherine, perhaps a sympathetic courtier, perhaps one of the few remaining souls who still believed in mercy. That night, she went to the king and knelt beside his bed. She spoke not of books, nor theology, but of her ignorance. She told him that she only argued with him about religion to distract him from the pain in his leg, that she only sought to learn from his wisdom, that he was the sun, and she merely a flower turning toward the light. She flattered him as no one had dared in years. Henry listened. His ego, swollen as his body, softened. When the guards came for her the next day, Henry sent them away. And then he turned on those who had plotted her downfall. He shouted at them in court, accused them of disloyalty, and reasserted his trust in his wife. But Catherine did not take this as victory. She knew the tightrope she walked. She kissed the king's hand. She retreated again into silence. And so, the months passed. The king grew heavier, sicker. His leg required more dressing. His mobility failed. The physicians whispered of gangrene. The courtiers exchanged glances in hallways, wondering who would fall next. Catherine Parr remained by his side, managing the household, shielding the children, enduring the blood and the moods, and pretending not to see the darkening shadow gathering over the realm. Henry was no longer the terror of Europe. He was the echo of himself. And Catherine, as if understanding the value of shadows, stayed close, but never too close. She played her role perfectly. And for that, she lived. When the end finally came in January of 1547, Henry's bed was surrounded by men, not by queens or lovers, but by doctors, priests, and lords. Catherine was not present at the moment of death, but she was there in the days that followed, managing the practicalities, ensuring the children were protected, overseeing the mourning rituals with grace. Henry had ordered that he be buried beside Jane Seymour, and so he was. Catherine made no complaint. She bowed her head. She stepped back into widowhood. But this time, she was free. The sixth wife, the survivor, the nurse who outlasted the tyrant. She had entered the lion's den and emerged untouched. No trial, no scandal, no tomb beside the king. Just breath and life, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the smartest way to rule a monster is to make him believe he is still a king. By the time the year 1546 gave way to the bitter January of 1547, Henry VIII was no longer a king who walked among his people. He was a weight massive, immobile, festering, the once golden prince who had leapt onto horses, who had danced in polished halls beneath golden chandeliers, who had bent longbows and smashed lances with a roar of triumph, was now a figure trapped inside his own skin. The ulcers in his leg had deepened, tunneling through flesh, oozing with infection. No balm could soothe. His breath came heavy and sour. His appetite remained vast, even as movement grew impossible. To serve him was to breathe in the scent of decay and pretend it was incense. To live near him was to know that death, though still distant, was now seated permanently at his side. The king's throne had become a prison. A massive wheeled chair carried him from room to room. Mechanical hoists had been installed in his palaces to lift him from one floor to the next. Servants padded the halls in silence, eyes lowered, steps soft, lest the pain wake him in the night and summon his rage. He could still roar when angered. I could still sign death warrants with a trembling hand. But even his anger had changed. It had become thick and slow, like blood clotted in a wound. He lashed out less frequently, but with more finality. He did not rage to prove himself anymore. He raged to remind others that he still existed. The court had transformed to match him, once a place of music and masks, where courtiers composed verses for queens and colours, brightened the stone walls like spring. Now the air was stale and hushed. Diplomacy was managed by factions, their leaders more interested in succession than loyalty. The reformists, led by the Seymours and Archbishop Cranmer, circled the young Prince Edward like falcons guarding their claim. The conservatives, bitter and aging, watched with suspicion, hoping for the day when Mary might take the throne and restore the old religion. Henry, bloated and half-shadowed by death, sat between them like a stone idol, no longer a player, but still the dealer of final cards. And still, even in this state, he made war. In 1542, he had marched against the Scots again, achieving victory at Solway Moss, a battle that left Scotland bruised, and their king dead of illness or grief within weeks. In 1544, he had returned to France, dragging his rotting leg and swollen pride across the Channel, in pursuit of glory that had long since passed him by. He took Boleyn. He flew banners. He watched as men died for a dream that no longer glittered. And when he returned to England, it was with less money, fewer allies, and a wound that now refused to close. The wealth stolen from the monasteries had already vanished, spent on palaces and pageantry, on cannon fire and foreign soil. The gold and silver once melted down from sacred objects now lined the goblets of men who no longer believed in saints. The countryside still bore the scars, churches stripped bare, relics destroyed, parishes floundering without aid. The poor, once fed and sheltered by monks, now wandered or starved, dependent on the mercy of local landlords or the indifferent hand of parish law. The England Henry had shaped was no longer Catholic, but it was not yet Protestant either. It was something harder, more brittle. It was a kingdom in limbo, waiting for its king to die so it could begin again. Catherine Parr continued to manage the household with tireless grace. She read to him from scripture. She soothed him when the fever came. She played nurse, wife, and hostage all at once. The three royal children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, were all within the orbit of court again. All watched, all manoeuvred like chess pieces, by those who understood that the future was only one final heartbeat away. Henry still signed orders, still spoke with bluster when foreign envoys approached. But everyone saw it now. The shake in his hand, the way his eyes lingered too long on the flames in the hearth, as if trying to see something beyond them. And then, in December of 1546, he made his final public appearance. Pale, swollen, wrapped in black and gold, he addressed Parliament from a wheeled throne. His voice was hoarse, but commanding. He spoke of unity, of legacy, of order. Few heard the words. They watched the figure instead. They saw the breathless pauses, the sweat beneath the crown. They understood. The rain was ending. The sun that had once blazed over England was sinking behind the horizon. By January, he was confined to bed. The leg now stank so badly that even the most loyal attendants struggled not to gag. Courtiers dared not speak of death by royal decree. To predict the king's end was treason. No one mentioned a will. No one asked about burial. Instead, they circled like birds above a carcass, still twitching. Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle, moved with quiet purpose. Archbishop Cranmer kept vigil from a distance. Catherine Parr remained, reading psalms aloud to a man who no longer listened. In his final hours, Henry asked for Cranmer. But when the Archbishop arrived, the king could no longer speak. His lips trembled. His eyes fluttered. And then, in a moment that passed without thunder or candlelight, He reached out and squeezed the Archbishop's hand. A silent gesture, a final affirmation, and then nothing. It was the 28th day of January, in the year 1547. The king was dead. They kept it secret for 3 days. The doors were shut. The windows shuttered. The guards doubled. Plans unfolded behind curtains. The Privy Council met. The boy, Edward, only 9 years old, was named king. A regency council of 16 men would rule in his name, but everyone already knew who would lead Edward Seymour. Now the Lord Protector, the machinery that Henry had so meticulously built, would now be operated by others. When the death was finally announced, the mourning was public and grand. Black banners hung from the palace towers. Bells rang across London. A great funeral was planned. The king's body, wrapped in rich cloths, was carried to Windsor. There, he was buried in St. George's Chapel, beside Jane Seymour, the only one of his wives to give him a son, and the only one he chose to lie with in death. The tomb, planned to be magnificent, was never finished. Funds ran out. The golden statues were never cast. What remained was a slab of stone. Simple, silent. No monument could contain him. No engraving could capture the shape of what he had been. Henry VIII had changed England more than any monarch before him. He had torn it from the Pope's grasp, dissolved its sacred spaces, remade its nobility, rewritten its laws. He had fathered 3 children, ruled for nearly 4 decades, executed 2 wives, destroyed his closest friends, and bent the nation to his will. But in the end, he died like every man does, in a bed, surrounded by those who waited. And the England he left behind, it waited, too. When the breath left Henry's bloated body in the early hours of the 28th of January, in the year 1547, the walls of Whitehall did not tremble. The sun did not dim. The Thames did not rise in mourning. History has no need for thunder. It continues, as it always does, in silence and in waiting. And so it was that the great, thunderous king, who had turned England upside down, died quietly, as all men must, leaving behind a fragile boy, a battered country, and a question no one could yet answer. What does a kingdom do when the man who believed himself its god is gone? Edward VI was just 9 years old when he became king, and though his blood was royal, his voice was still childish, his limbs thin and growing, his soul not yet fully formed. But he had tutors, and ambition, and a mind sharpened by Latin and Scripture. He had been raised Protestant, truly Protestant, in a way that his father never fully was. To Edward, the break from Rome was not political necessity but spiritual truth, and under his reign, or rather under the rule of his uncle, Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, the country lunged forward into reform with a new, zealous clarity. Latin vanished from the churches. The English Book of Common Prayer was introduced. Statues were toppled, altars torn down, priests were ordered to marry. The saints, once painted on walls and sung in litany, were scraped into dust. The pulse of England shifted again, harder, more angular. For those who had welcomed reform, it was a long-awaited breath. For those who had clung to the old ways, it was terror in a new tongue. And terror begat resistance. In the West, Devon and Cornwall rose up in rebellion in the year 1549, demanding the return of the old Mass, the Latin prayers, the bread and wine they had known all their lives. These were not nobles, but farmers, labourers, townsfolk people, for whom religion was not politics, but identity. They fought not for the Pope, but for rhythm, for memory, for the world that Henry had shattered, but that still echoed in their ears. The rebellion was crushed. Thousands were killed. The child king's government showed no mercy. Meanwhile, the king himself grew thinner, pale, brilliant, sickly, and far from him, in quiet chambers away from the council and the court, lived Henry's last queen, Catherine Parr, who had remarried after his death to Thomas Seymour. The very man she had once loved before duty claimed her. For a short while, it seemed she might finally know peace. She even took young Elizabeth into her household. The clever girl with flame-red hair and eyes like daggers. But peace, as always, was fleeting. Catherine died of childbed fever in 1548. Just days after giving birth to her first child, and Thomas Seymour, hungry for power and jealous of his brother's role as protector, soon found himself flirting with treason and with Elizabeth. He was executed in 1549. Elizabeth survived the scandal. She said nothing. She learned, and she waited. By 1553, the boy king was dying. Tuberculosis, they said, or something crueler. He coughed blood. He shrank beneath his robes. But even as his body failed, his mind burned. He did not want Mary, his Catholic half-sister, to succeed him, nor Elizabeth, daughter of the woman his father had executed. Instead, he named Lady Jane Grey his cousin, his Protestant peer as heir, a girl of 16, pale and trembling, married off to the son of the ambitious Duke of Northumberland. She was proclaimed queen after Edward's death in July of that year. She lasted 9 days, because Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, entered London like the return of an ancient tide. She had waited through humiliation, through her mother's disgrace, through her own downgrading from princess to bastard. Now, the crown that had been denied to her by her father, her brother, and the very laws of England, was finally hers. The people, weary and confused, welcomed her. She restored the old rights. Latin returned. The Pope's name was spoken in Mass once more. And in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, fires were lit. 300 men and women, Protestants, were burned during her reign. They called her Bloody Mary. But Mary was not made of blood. She was made of grief. She had grown up watching her mother suffer and die in exile. She had been cast aside, forced to serve her younger sister, and treated like a pawn by men who believed women were fit for nothing but marriage or martyrdom. So when Mary found herself queen, she looked for certainty where she had always been told to look in Rome. In tradition, in obedience, she married Philip of Spain, a union deeply unpopular in England. She suffered false pregnancies. She aged quickly. The tumorous pain in her abdomen worsened. Her hopes for a Catholic heir slipped away. And in 1558, at the age of 42, Mary died. Her sister Elizabeth ascended, and the Tudor world shifted once again. Because Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen whose blood had soaked the stones of Tower Green, was everything her father had feared and hoped for. She was no man's puppet. She was fierce, brilliant, cunning, and solitary. She would never marry. She would reign for 44 years. She would defeat the Spanish Armada. She would dance between suitors, enemies, and allies like a woman walking across swords. She would become legend. And beneath the red hair and the carefully chosen words, she would always carry her father's ghost in her shadow. But it is not only Elizabeth's triumph that echoes. It is what she inherited. Henry VIII had forged a crown of contradictions. He had created a nation no longer bound to Rome, yet uncertain of its true faith. He had killed wives in pursuit of sons. And in the end, it was his daughters who ruled. He had scattered the monasteries and given their wealth to a new nobility, ensuring that Protestantism would survive not through piety, but through property. He had made the monarch not just a sovereign, but a priest-king, the head of a church. The final word, he had taught England how to obey not through love, but through fear. And yet, by doing so, he had built a structure sturdy enough to outlast even his own destruction. The kingdom did not collapse when he died. It endured through fire, through war, through rebellion, through women in crowns, and children on thrones. It endured. The kings that followed would face civil war, regicide, revolution, but the monarchy bent, bruised, bloodstained, survived. The laws that Henry wrote, the parliament he empowered to serve his whims, would one day turn against his descendants and demand accountability. The church he created would become an institution far beyond his original vision, and the nation he shaped with his hungers, his fears, his pride, would continue to change long after his bones turned to dust. So now, close your eyes and imagine the world he left behind. A kingdom of towers and fields, of ruined abbeys and new manors, of peasants speaking English prayers for the first time, of merchants building fortunes on lands that once belonged to monks, of boys reading scripture in grammar schools founded in former cloisters, of women walking through marketplaces wearing the cross of a reformed church, and somewhere, beneath the cold stone floor of St. George's Chapel, lies a king, buried beside the wife who gave him a son, his tomb incomplete, his story never quite finished.